The air in the gilded cage was a carefully curated symphony of hushed reverence. It smelled of old money, lemon polish, and the faintest ghost of seared scallops. Every sound was muted. The distant chime of a fork against porcelain, the whisper of sommeliers, the nearly imperceptible hum of the climate control system that kept the city's oppressive humidity at bay. Into this fragile piece walked Kenji Tanaka, and the symphony shattered. Not with a crash, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. He moved like a shark, flanked by two silent men in suits that were just a little too sharp, their shoulders a little too broad. The other patrons, men and women accustomed to being the center of any room they entered, suddenly found an intense interest in their wine glasses, their napkins, the intricate patterns on their plates. They shrank, becoming part of the scenery. Mr. Alastair Finch, the restaurant manager, a man whose entire existence was a tightly wound bundle of nerves, scurried forward, his smile a pained, desperate rictus. He bowed, a gesture too deep, too subservient for the establishment's supposed prestige. Kiana, standing by the service station polishing a wine glass, watched the scene unfold. It was only her third shift. She saw the fear, thick and oily, coating every surface Tanaka's gaze touched. She had been warned about difficult customers, but this was different. This was a predator, and the restaurant was his hunting ground. Finch, sweating through his waistcoat, directed them to the best table, the secluded corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the entire dining room. Then, the inevitable happened. The regular server for that section, a veteran named Thomas, suddenly felt a debilitating migraine coming on, his face pale and clammy. Another server was suddenly clumsy. A third recalled an urgent task in the kitchen. Finch's frantic eyes scanned the room and landed on Kiana. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Just take his order. Be polite. Be invisible," she nodded, her face a mask of calm professionalism, and walked toward the table where power and cruelty sat waiting for their amuse-bouche. Tanaka watched her approach, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He leaned back, letting the silence stretch, forcing her to stand there under his scrutiny. Finally, he spoke, not in English, but in a torrent of harsh, guttural syllables from a language she had never heard spoken in a public place. It was a complex, ancient dialect, designed to isolate and confuse. His eyes, small and dark, glinted with the smug certainty of a man about to enjoy a small, perfect moment of humiliation. He was not just ordering dinner. He was asserting his dominance over this place, over this girl, over everyone who could hear his voice and not understand. His men smirked. The game had begun. The Gilded Cage was less a restaurant and more a museum of culinary ambition. Kiana had felt it the moment she'd walked in for her interview. The walls were paneled in a dark, lustrous mahogany that seemed to drink the light, accented by fixtures of brushed brass that glowed with a soft, warm luminescence. Each table was an island, draped in starched white linen so crisp it could have been folded from paper. The silverware was heavy, the crystals so fine it seemed to hum when touched. Her uniform, a pristine white button-down shirt and a deep crimson vest, felt like a costume, a role she was to play in a grand, nightly performance. Mr. Finch had hired her with a palpable sense of reluctance, his eyes darting over her resume as if searching for a hidden flaw he could use as an excuse. "Our clientele expects a certain standard," he had said, his voice trailing off, leaving the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The standard was clear, unobtrusive, deferential, and preferably, someone who didn't stand out. Kiana, with her quiet confidence and observant eyes, both fit the bill and defied it. She learned quickly. She learned the subtle language of the staff, the slight nod that meant a table needed water, the flicker of an eyelid that signaled a difficult patron. She learned the geography of the dining room, the currents of power that flowed between tables. She saw how the staff orbited the wealthy and the influential, their smiles brighter, their attentiveness sharper. She also learned about Kenji Tanaka. His name was spoken in whispers, a ghost story to frighten new employees. They said he owned half the city's shipping ports, that he had a taste for cruelty, and that his visits were rare but always catastrophic for someone. He was a man who enjoyed testing the limits of civility, finding the cracks in people's composure and prying them open with a casual, brutal efficiency. On her first 2 shifts, the restaurant had been a placid sea of quiet conversations and polite requests. She had excelled, her movements fluid and efficient, her memory for orders flawless. She was good at her job because she understood it was about more than carrying plates. It was about managing expectations, anticipating needs, and most importantly, becoming invisible. Tonight, however, invisibility was not an option. As she walked toward Tanaka's table, the crimson of her vest felt like a target painted on her chest. The weight of the room pressed in on her, the collective anxiety of every patron and staff member focused on this single, precarious interaction. She was the buffer, the offering, sent to appease the beast. The silence at Tanaka's table was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sound. His 2 guards sat ramrod straight, their hands resting on their laps, their gazes fixed on some distant point over Kiana's shoulder. They were carved from stone, their stillness more menacing than any overt threat. Tanaka, however, was all fluid motion and languid arrogance. He gestured to the water glass with a flick of his wrist, and Kiana filled it without a word, her movements economical and precise. He watched her every move, his eyes dissecting her composure, searching for the first tremor of fear. The other diners were a gallery of averted glances, a study in feigned indifference. A woman in pearls suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating. A man in a tailored suit examined his cuticles with the focus of a surgeon. Yet, Kiana could feel their attention, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the performance to reach its climax. Tanaka finished his unintelligible monologue and leaned back, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. The dialect he'd used was obscure, a relic from a remote, mountainous region, known for its labyrinthine grammar and its tonal subtleties that could change the meaning of a sentence entirely. It was a language of insiders, a code for the initiated, and he had used it as a weapon to paint her as an outsider, an ignorant foreigner in a world she could never comprehend. He savored her silence, mistaking her thoughtful pause for panicked confusion. To twist the knife, he repeated a single phrase from his order, enunciating each syllable with exaggerated, mocking slowness, his head tilted as if coaxing a particularly dim-witted pet. "Did you get that?" he asked in perfect, unaccented English, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "Or was it too complicated for you?" Mr. Finch, still hovering near the service station, looked as if he might actually collapse. His hand was pressed to his chest, his face the color of spoiled milk. He was calculating the cost of this disaster, the loss of a powerful patron, the damage to the restaurant's reputation, the brutal, public dressing down he would have to give this new girl to appease the monster in his dining room. He had thrown her to the wolves, and now he could only watch the slaughter. He prayed she would just apologize, stammer something about getting a translator, and flee. But Kiana didn't flee. She simply stood there, her notepad held loosely in her hand, her gaze locked with Tanaka's. Inside Kiana's mind, there was no panic. There was only a calm, quiet echo from the past. The harsh, guttural sounds coming from Tanaka's mouth were not alien to her. They were the sounds of her childhood, the cadence of her grandfather's voice as he sat in his study, surrounded by dusty books and maps of places that no longer existed. Her grandfather, a celebrated professor of sociolinguistics and a former diplomat, had believed that language was not merely a tool for communication, but the very architecture of a culture, a repository of its history, its fears, and its soul. He had raised her after her parents' passing, and his home had been a library of the world. Instead of fairy tales, he had read her ancient poems in their original tongues. He taught her that to truly understand a people, you had to understand the nuances of how they spoke, the words they chose for love and for war, for honor and for shame. The dialect Tanaka was using was one of his specialties. He had called it the language of mountain fortresses, a tongue forged in isolation and suspicion, where politeness was a mask for strategy, and every phrase held a dozen potential meanings. He had made her practice its intricate phonetics, its shifting tones, its deliberately ambiguous honorifics. "This is a language of power, little bird," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "People who speak it do not ask for things. They position themselves to receive them. They do not threaten. They create the conditions for your failure. To answer them in English is to surrender. To answer them in their own tongue is to meet them on the battlefield of their choosing." She could see him now, a faint, comforting image in her mind's eye, his kind, wrinkled face, the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. He had prepared her for this moment without ever knowing it. As Tanaka's condescending English question echoed in the silent room, Kiana felt not fear, but a profound, grounding clarity. This was not a customer ordering food. This was a warlord testing the defenses of a village. He wasn't asking for a meal. He was demanding fealty. And in her mind, she heard her grandfather's voice once more, a quiet whisper of advice from long ago. Never let a man who uses language as a weapon see you as a victim. Use his own blade to show him its edge. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air filling her lungs, steadying her. She was not a waitress anymore. She was her grandfather's student, and the lesson was about to begin. The Gilded Cage was no longer a restaurant. It was a negotiating table.
Kiana met Kenji Tanaka a smug, expectant gaze.
For a fraction of a second, she allowed the silence to hold, letting the weight of his arrogance settle completely. Then, she tilted her head just so, a subtle gesture of thoughtful consideration. Her lips parted, and what emerged was not an apology, not a stammered excuse, but the same ancient, complex dialect he had used, flowing from her with the unhurried grace of a native speaker. Her pronunciation was flawless, her command of the tonal shifts and honorifics perfect. But she did not simply repeat his order back to him. She elevated the exchange. "Your request for the seared Ora King salmon is an excellent one," she began, her voice calm and melodic in the harsh tongue. "However, the bitter notes in the accompanying root vegetable puree, as you have specified it prepared, may clash with the delicate profile of the vintage Bordeaux you have selected. A minor point, of course, for a man of your discerning palate." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The words were deferential, the tone respectful, but the message was a thunderclap. She had not only understood his obscure language, she had critiqued his choice, subtly asserting a superior knowledge of the very refinement he sought to weaponize. She then continued, her voice never wavering. "If I may be so bold, the chef could prepare the puree with a touch of honeyed parsnip instead. It would complement the wine's earthy undertones and elevate the entire dish. A suggestion for your consideration. Of course, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy, wrapped in the guise of service." She had corrected him, improved his order, and done it all within the rigid, honor-bound framework of his own chosen language. She had met him on his battlefield and demonstrated a more profound mastery of its terrain. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Kenji Tanaka froze. His condescending smile evaporated, melting from his face as if it were made of wax. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating in shock. The hand that had been resting languidly on the table clenched into a fist, the knuckles turning white. It was as if a switch had been flipped, cutting power to his entire facade of confident superiority. In its place was raw, unfiltered disbelief, followed by the dark, rising tide of humiliation. He, Kenji Tanaka, a man who moved through the world on a wave of fear and deference, had just been publicly outmaneuvered by a waitress. The two stone-faced guards at his side shifted, their professional stillness broken. One of them blinked rapidly, the other's jaw tightened. They had understood every word. The hunter had just watched the prey turn and bear its own, much sharper, teeth. The silence that followed Kiana's response was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. The first had been heavy with oppressive tension, the silence of a crowd waiting for a public execution. This new silence was sharp, brittle, and electric with shock. It was the sound of a power dynamic shattering like glass. Every patron in the restaurant, who had previously been pretending not to listen, was now openly staring, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning delight. They had all witnessed the public deflation of a bully. Mr. Finch, by the service station, looked like he had seen a ghost. His jaw hung open, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror mixed with a bewildering awe. He had sent a lamb to the slaughter, and the lamb had just broken the wolf's jaw. Kenji Tanaka remained frozen for a long, agonizing moment. His mind, usually a sharp instrument of calculation and intimidation, was struggling to process the reversal. The carefully constructed persona of the untouchable overlord had been punctured. She hadn't just spoken his language, she had inhabited it, using its own rules of politeness and honor to subtly shame him. To challenge her now, to argue the point about the food pairing, would be to admit she was right, further cementing his loss of face. To lash out in anger would be to expose his fury as the impotent rage of a man who had been bested. He was trapped. The mask of arrogance, when it finally began to reassemble itself on his face, was a poor imitation of the original. The edges were cracked, the expression strained. The confident cruelty in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, venomous fury. He was no longer a predator toying with its food. He was a cornered animal, wounded and dangerous. Kiana, for her part, did not gloat. Her expression remained one of serene, professional attentiveness. She held her notepad and pen at the ready, as if she had merely offered a routine suggestion. This placid demeanor was, in itself, another blow. It communicated that this exchange, which had rocked his world to its foundations, was nothing remarkable to her. It was this, more than anything, that sealed his humiliation. She was not afraid of him. She had looked into the heart of his power, understood its mechanisms, and found it wanting. The entire restaurant seemed to lean in, waiting to see what he would do next. The power was no longer his to wield. It was hers, and she held it with a quiet, unshakable grace. Tanaka finally found his voice, but the instrument had lost its resonance. When he spoke, it was in clipped, guttural English, the carefully cultivated accent of a global power player now sounding harsh and clumsy. "The suggestion is acceptable," he ground out, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He could not bring himself to look at her. His gaze was fixed on the pristine white tablecloth, as if the intricate damask pattern held the answers to how his evening had so spectacularly unraveled. "Just bring the food," he added, a curt, dismissive wave of his hand intended to reclaim some semblance of authority. But the gesture was hollow, a king issuing edicts from a conquered throne. The spell was broken. The fear he commanded had been predicated on an aura of untouchable superiority, and that aura now lay in tatters around him. Kiana simply gave a small, respectful nod. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice even and polite. She turned and walked away from the table, her steps measured and unhurried. The eyes of the entire dining room followed her, not him. At a nearby table, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair and a finely tailored suit, who had been observing the entire exchange with a quiet, intelligent intensity, caught her eye. He was dining alone, and unlike the others, he had not pretended to be distracted. He had watched the confrontation like a grandmaster watching a chess match. As Kiana passed, he gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement from one strategist to another. His name was Marcus Harrison, a man whose quiet influence stretched far deeper into the city's foundations than Tanaka's loud-mouthed intimidation ever could. Harrison recognized what had just happened. It wasn't just a waitress putting a rude customer in his place. It was a display of immense character, of strategic thinking under pressure, of a rare and valuable courage. He had seen her weigh her options, absorb the intended insult, and turn it back on her aggressor with surgical precision. It was the kind of poise he looked for not in service staff, but in the executives who ran his multinational corporation. He took a slow sip of his wine, his gaze thoughtful. The most interesting event of his evening had just occurred, and it had nothing to do with the Michelin-starred food on his plate. He made a mental note. He needed to know the name of that young woman. The rest of the meal at Kenji Tanaka's table was a silent, agonizing affair. Kiana served each course with an impeccable, almost clinical, professionalism. She moved with a silent grace, placing plates, refilling glasses, and clearing dishes without a single wasted motion. Her presence was a constant, quiet reminder of his defeat. She never spoke unless spoken to, which he ensured she was not. He and his men ate in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The exquisite food, which on any other night would have been a symbol of his status and power, now felt like a prop in a play about his own downfall. Each bite was flavorless, each sip of the expensive Bordeaux a bitter reminder of the culinary correction he had been forced to accept. The dynamic in the room had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The other patrons were no longer afraid. The hushed conversation started up again, but now they were laced with a new energy, a current of shared satisfaction. Glances were exchanged over the rims of wine glasses, small, secret smiles shared. They had all been held hostage by Tanaka's reputation, and they had just witnessed his liberation at the hands of the most unlikely of saviors. Tanaka could feel their eyes on him. He, who thrived on being watched with fear and awe, was now the object of pity and quiet mockery. He could feel their whispers, their amusement. His power had always been a performance, and his audience had just walked out on him. When the check came, Kiana placed it discreetly on the table. Tanaka threw a black credit card down without looking at it. He signed the slip with a vicious, angry slash of the pen, his movements jerky and aggressive. He left no tip. It was a final, petty gesture of disrespect, a last attempt to assert his superiority by devaluing her labor. But it had no effect. It was the impotent act of a defeated man. As he and his men rose to leave, he made a point of striding past Kiana without a single glance in her direction. It was meant to be the ultimate insult, to render her invisible once more. But everyone in the room knew the truth. He wasn't ignoring her because she was beneath him. He was ignoring her because he could not bear to look at the person who had so effortlessly dismantled him. The moment the heavy doors of the gilded cage swung shut behind him, a collective sigh of relief swept through the dining room, followed by a spontaneous, quiet ripple of applause. It was for her. Mr. Finch approached Kiana's station like a man walking on a tightrope over a canyon. His face was a chaotic jumble of emotions, the residual terror from Tanaka's presence, sheer disbelief at what he had witnessed, and a dawning, horrified realization of how badly he had misjudged her. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of what to even say. Should he scold her for provoking a dangerous man? Or thank her for what exactly? For saving the restaurant's honor in a way he never could? His managerial rulebook had no chapter for this. Before he could formulate a single coherent sentence, a calm, authoritative voice cut through his confusion. "Young lady, might I have a word?" It was Marcus Harrison, the silver-haired gentleman. He had risen from his table and was standing a few feet away, his expression warm and intrigued. Finch immediately shrank back, his own authority dissolving in the presence of a man he recognized as a platinum-level patron, the owner of the very hotel in which they stood. "Mr. Harrison, sir. Is everything all right?" Finch stammered, rushing forward. Harrison waved a dismissive hand, his eyes still fixed on Kiana. "Everything is more than all right, Alistair. I was just enjoying the floor show." He turned his full attention to Kiana, who stood her ground, her posture poised. "That was one of the most remarkable displays of grace under pressure I have ever seen," Harrison said, his voice resonating with genuine admiration. "My name is Marcus Harrison." He extended a hand. Kiana took it. Her handshake was firm, confident. "Kiana," she replied simply. "Mr. Finch mentioned you were new," Harrison continued, "but he failed to mention you were a multilingual diplomatic strategist moonlighting as a waitress. Where did you study that particular dialect?" Kiana hesitated for a moment. "My grandfather," she said. "He was a linguist," Harrison nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "Of course. Genius is often inherited. Kiana, I've been searching for months for a new lead for my corporation's East Asia acquisitions team. It's a position that requires not just fluency in languages, but a deep understanding of cultural nuance, an iron will, and the ability to negotiate with difficult personalities. It requires someone who doesn't just speak the language of business, but the language of power." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The salary would be considerably more than you are making here, and you would never have to worry about the size of a customer's tip again. My office will call you tomorrow to arrange an interview. Consider it a formality." He handed her his personal business card. "I believe your talents are being wasted here." 6 months later, the view from Kiana's office was a sprawling panorama of the city skyline. The Gilded Cage, a tiny, glittering speck below, was a world away. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric a stark contrast to the crimson vest she had once worn like a uniform of servitude. She was no longer serving tables. She was chairing them. Across the polished mahogany boardroom table, a team of negotiators from a rival conglomerate shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had come in expecting a routine, aggressive negotiation, but had instead found themselves in a subtle, intricate dance of strategy they were ill-equipped for. Kiana was leading the conversation, her voice calm and measured, her arguments precise and unassailable. She wielded information like a scalpel, dismantling their positions with a quiet, relentless logic. She had her grandfather's intellect and Marcus Harrison's mentorship, a combination that had made her a formidable presence in the corporate world. Harrison had been right. Her skills were perfectly suited to this new battlefield. She understood that every negotiation was a conversation about power, and she knew how to listen to the words that weren't being said. She had become a master at turning her opponent's arrogance and assumptions into weapons she could use against them. In a quiet moment during a break in the negotiations, she glanced at a news feed on her tablet. A small headline caught her eye. "Tanaka Enterprises faces full-scale federal audit amidst allegations of racketeering." The article detailed the sudden, aggressive and multi-pronged investigation into Kenji Tanaka's vast and shadowy empire. His shipping ports were frozen, his assets seized, his carefully constructed world of fear and intimidation crumbling under the weight of institutional power. There was no direct link, no smoking gun, but Kiana knew. It was the quiet, invisible influence of Marcus Harrison at work, a man who did not tolerate bullies in his city, whether they were in his restaurants or in his boardrooms. Justice had not been loud or violent. It had been a quiet, systematic dismantling, as elegant and precise as her takedown of Tanaka in the restaurant that night. She closed the tablet, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. She hadn't just won an argument that evening. She had reclaimed her own narrative. She had refused to be the victim in someone else's story of power. And in doing so, she had written the first chapter of her own. The city stretched out before her, a landscape of infinite possibility, waiting for her next move. The game was still being played, but now, she was one of the players who set the board.